Well, for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about the power of a dream, and we've been saying this, that the power of a dream can move us, and not only us, but those around us, closer to and eventually into a better way of life. And last week, we talked about how that begins to happen because when you and I have a vision for the future, and when we begin to dream about a better tomorrow, we end up inevitably doing things better today. Whenever we dream about a better tomorrow, we end up, without sometimes even thinking about it, we end up doing better things today. That's why it's so important to have a dream and a vision for your life, to have a dream and a vision for your family, because when you dream of a better day for your family, inevitably you will end up doing better things for your family today. And as you do those itty-bitty things today differently, your life begins to shift in a better direction. Whenever you get a dream and vision for your marriage and you dream of a better tomorrow, you end up doing better things today. The same as a parent, the same as it relates to your finances and as it relates to your faith, because when we dream of a better tomorrow, we end up doing better things today. We end up praying better. We pray bigger prayers. We end up making wiser decisions. We make necessary changes. We become stronger. And in doing so, we become a better version of ourselves. And in the Christian life, we call that growth. And that's ultimately what all of us are looking for. We're looking for progress, because that is the power of a dream and a vision. You dream of a better tomorrow, you end up doing better things today as you begin to move into a future reality. So that's what we've been talking about. But today, we're going to talk about what I think may be one of the most beneficial and one of the most powerful advantages of having a dream and a vision for your future. That when you have a dream for your future and you actively pursue it in the present, something powerful happens. Now, don't miss it. When you get a dream for the future and actively pursue it in the present, because that's the key thing. It's just not enough to have a dream for the future, but you begin to actively pursue it in the present. And when that happens, you begin to rob yourself of something in the future. When you get a vision for the future and you pursue it in the present, you are robbing something out of your future. It's something that you don't want in your future. It's something that you actively begin to prevent in your future. It's something that you don't want to be part of your story. It's something that you don't want to have to deal with one day. And when you get a dream for the future, you pursue it in the present, you are actively removing that which you don't want to have to deal with out of your future. And the thing that I'm talking about is regret. Now, most of us have lived long enough. We've already compiled some regret. But the good news is you don't have to pile any more on what you already have. And that's the power of a dream. That's the power of a vision. If you've got regret in your past, the good news is there's grace for that. The good news is that God can take everything and turn it for good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. And so we know that in our past we've got regrets. God's turning that for good. But when we're thinking about the future, the good news is you don't have to pile any more regret on. I don't have to pile any more regret on top of what I already have. And that's where the power of a dream comes in. Because a dream for tomorrow, pursuing it today, ultimately will rob me of regret in the future. Let me say it this way. Having a vision for tomorrow and pursuing that vision today puts purpose in your present and keeps regret out of your future. Nobody wants regret as part of their story. Nobody wants to, at the end of their life, have regret that they wrestle with. Nobody wants to get to the end of their life and think about the what ifs and the what could have been and the what should have been and the if onlys and all the things that regret brings with it. Now, what I'm about to say is like the downer part of the message. I just want to give you a FYI. But we're going to come out of the down part of the message and it's going to get better. It's going to get positive, okay? So just stick with me. But statistically speaking, most of us will not die suddenly. Most of us won't die in a car accident. Most of us won't die in a vending machine accident. Most of us won't die, hot air balloon. Most of us won't die like that. Statistically speaking, most of us will die slowly. Now, you can consider that horrible, and I don't want to think about that, and that's so negative, and that's so downing, but think about this for just a moment. Most of us, when we die, we will die in a bed somewhere. And some of us will have hours, some of us will have days, some of us will have weeks, and some of us will have months to think back on the life that we lived. Now, that's an inevitable thing that will happen for those of us who are waiting to die. And in the moments, the hours, the days, the months, as we are waiting to die, we will inevitably think back over our lives. We will think back over the pages of our story. And inevitably, we will think about the pages of our story that we wish that we could go back and we could rewrite. But we can't rewrite what has already been written. But we will be on a bed somewhere, someday, and we will think back. And the one thing that we don't want to wrestle with in those moments, those days, those weeks, those months, the thing that we don't want to wrestle with on our deathbed, trust me, and you know this to be true, is regret. We don't want to get to the end and have a room full of what ifs, what could have been, what should have been, if only. We don't want to die that way. The good news is we don't have to. The good news is the decisions that you are making right now, and this could be bad news based on the decisions that you're making. So the good news and the bad news is the decisions that you are making right now are making the bed that one day you will lie in and one day you will die in. The decisions that you and I are making right now are making the bed that one day we will die in. And those decisions that we are making right now, one day we will look back and we'll either be glad that we did or we'll regret the decisions that we made. And the good news is, when you have a dream for the future and you actively pursue it in the present, the one thing you won't have to die with in the future is regret. Because you will have lived life in such a way that you'll be glad that you lived that way when you get to the end of your life. Because answering the question of how you want to die answers the question of how you should live. Some of us, we don't even want to think about it. We can't even sit down and plan our own funeral. It freaks us out. We don't think about the music. We just let the family fend for themselves. We don't give them any insight. We don't make any plans because we don't like to think about that. But here's the thing. Death clarifies life. And nothing will help you see life more clearly than the prospect of dying. And if you think you're dying or you think death is imminent, it helps you to see life more clearly than you'll ever see life at any other point. That's the reason the psalmist said, Lord, teach us to number our days so that we might apply our hearts to wisdom. Because nothing clarifies life like death. So how do you want to die? And I know how you want to die as it relates to regret. You don't want to die with regret. And if that's how you don't want to die, then that tells you how you live today. You get a dream for the future, you pursue it in the present so you don't have to die with regret later on. And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about a man in the scripture who answered the question of how he wanted to die correctly and then lived his life around it. I want to talk about a man who had a dream for the future and he avoided regret. He had a dream for the future, he pursued it all of his life. He refused to give up on his dream no matter what happened. And listen, he refused to give up on his dream no matter who happened. Because some of you, what gave you that moment when you gave your dream up, it was a what. But for some of you, what caused you to give your dream up, it was a who. And the person that we're going to talk about today, he refused to allow a what or a who to take his dream away. He continued to dream no matter what. He built his life around his dream. He pursued his dream. He chased his dream. He was willing to give his life for his dream. And when push came to shove, he was willing to fight for his dream. And because of it, the one thing he didn't have to wrestle with at the end of his life was regret. And the person that I want to talk about is a man by the name of Caleb. Now, when we think about Caleb, we inevitably stick his partner there. We always think of Caleb and Joshua and Caleb. Now, I'm not going to talk about Joshua because Joshua got a whole book, right? So there's a whole book of Joshua. We can go read Joshua's story, but I want to talk about Caleb. Caleb had been a slave in Egypt, right? He'd been a slave in Egypt, and then the whole storyline with Moses. Moses comes down, delivers the children of Israel out of Egypt, parts the Red Sea. Then he leads the people out, and he frees and liberates the people of God. Caleb had been a slave in Egypt. He had been there when Moses came down and led them out. Caleb was there when God parted the Red Sea. And then after the nation left Egypt, God brought them out in order to take them into something else. Every time God takes you out of one thing, he's taking you into something else. He took them out of Egypt in order to take them into the promised land. Because even Caleb and the rest of his Israelite fellow countrymen, they had heard this legend, they had heard this story passed down, that once upon a time, God had made a promise to one of their patriarchs named Abraham, and to his son Isaac, and to his son's son Jacob. That God had made a promise once upon a time that one day he was going to take Abraham's people and give them a land. That he was going to give them a land to call their own. That he was going to give them a land that they were going to call home. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. It became known as the promised land because God had promised this land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for 430 plus years, while the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, they had talked about and wondered about and dreamed about whether God would ever keep that promise and whether that promise was real or was it just this story that had been handed down one generation to another. Caleb grew up in Egypt as a slave. He was there when God delivered them. And once Moses took them out of Egypt, inevitably the question would have been, Moses, where are you taking us to? Where are we going? And Moses would tell the nation of Israel, we are going to the promised land. We are going to the place that God promised our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But before we get there, we're going to make a stop. So Moses led the nation of Israel to camp at Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. And they would spend, most scholars think, about 2 years at Mount Sinai. And that's where God's going to come down on the mountain, thunderings, lightning, smoke, all of that. God's going to give Moses the law. They're going to get organized as a people. They're going to become a law-abiding people. So they're going to spend close to a couple of years at Sinai. And then Moses is going to look at the nation and say, it's time to go. It's time to leave Sinai. We're going to the promised land. We're going to take the land that God has given us. Now, FYI, in case you're not familiar with this story, this is not a land that's uninhabited. This is a land that's inhabited by another people, many multiple people groups. And this is not going to be easy for the nation of Israel. Just because God promises you something and God promises me something, and just because God allocates and provides, doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, and it doesn't mean it's going to be simple, and it doesn't mean it's going to be comfortable and painless. They were going to have to fight for the promise. They were going to have to fight for their inheritance. They were going to have to fight for this dream of a better place, a better tomorrow, this land flowing with milk and honey. So Moses says, it's time. We're going to go into the land. And as you read different parts of this narrative and you begin to piece it together, we know that out of the book of Deuteronomy, that when Moses tells the people, it's time to go into the land, the people kind of panicked. And the people were struck with fear. And so they decided, many of you may have heard this, they decided to elect a committee of 12. It was a committee on feasibility. They determined that they needed a feasibility committee to go in and study whether or not they could do what God told them to do. They decided that they were going to put together a committee that would go in and ultimately gather intelligence and gather information so that they could ultimately decide whether or not they were going to obey God or not, because God was the one telling them to go into the land. But instead of going into the land immediately the way that God told them to, the people said, let's throw in 12 people and let's let them go in and see what's going on and then come back and advise us about what we can do, should do, could do. And so Moses gave in to the people, and he elected 12 people, 12 of the best leaders in all of Israel. And we only remember 2 of the 12, Caleb and Joshua. We don't remember the other 10, and we'll find out why we don't remember the other 10 in just a moment. He sends the 12 spies into the land. They're going to stay about 40 days over in the land of Canaan, the land of promise, land flowing with milk and honey. And at the end of weeks over there, the 12 spies come back and they're going to deliver a report to Moses and all the nation. And this is where we pick up the story. It says, they, the spies, gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. In other words, the 12 spies, after spending weeks over in the promised land, they came back and said, it's as good as we've been told. It's as good as what we heard the promised land was going to be. It's everything that we heard and so much more. We figured you wouldn't believe us, so here's the fruit. Here's the evidence. We've brought back pomegranates. We've brought back grapes. We've brought back fruit from the land. here's the fruit. Have you ever seen fruit like this? Have you ever seen fruit so luscious? Taste it. Just go ahead. Taste this. This is incredible. That's what's waiting on the other side. It's just as good as what we've been told. The future is bright. God's promise was exactly what we've been told it was. And then, after building the people up, I don't know who taught them to communicate. I don't know who taught them how to speak to people, but they give this big lofty introduction, and then they say, but. And this is a big but, all right? But the people who live there are powerful. And the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. In other words, those people are so much more tall than we are. They're just bigger than we are. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a report for you, and it's awesome over there. It's incredible. There is milk. There is honey. It's awesome. Here's the fruit, but the people are powerful. The cities are fortified, and the people are bigger than we are. See, fear always has a but. Faith doesn't have a but. Faith says it's just as good as we've heard, let's go. Fear says it's just as good as we've heard, but. See, they had a dream and a vision for the future, but it wasn't as compelling as their fear. They had a dream and vision for the future, 10 of them, but their fear was greater than their vision and desire for a better tomorrow. 10 came back and said, but we can't do it. We shouldn't do it. Even though God said to do it, even though God said we could do it, we don't think we should do it because those people are big, it's going to be too tough, it's too risky. Let's not do it. And that's the reason you don't know any of those 10 gentlemen's name. Because we seldom remember negative, pessimistic, small-minded, non-visionary, dreaming people because their lives are seldom significant in making a difference or a ripple in their life or in the lives of other people. And so 10 came back and said, it's great, but, and this is where we're introduced to Caleb. It says, then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. Now, I don't know how that happened, but you got to keep in mind, there's a couple of million Jews at this particular point. And 10 have come back, and they're voicing their report, and they're saying, it's awesome, it's great, but we shouldn't do it. And then all the people, they're filled with uncertainty, and there's murmuring, and there's complaining, and there's grumbling, and there's just so much talking. And it seems as though the crowd could be a little bit, anarchy could break out at any moment, and things are just really uncomfortable. And all of a sudden, maybe Caleb gets up on a rock or something and says, hey! Everybody be quiet. It is just as good as we've ever heard. But we can do it. And we should do it. It looks good. It is good. Let's go. We can do it. And that's a dream and a vision according to Caleb. That's his dream. That's his vision. He went over, Joshua in the same boat. They saw the same thing that the other 10 saw, but they processed it differently. Caleb and Joshua processed it through the filter of faith. The other 10 processed it through the filter of fear. And it made all the difference in the world. They saw the same things, they heard the same things, but they gave a different report. He says, we ought to do this. God called us to do this. God promised that we could have this. Let's go. And then it says, but the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. Having a dream for the future is a powerful thing, but listen to me. Not having a dream for the future is a powerful thing. Your dream for the future and your vision for the future can move you and others closer to and eventually into a better way of life. Your lack of vision for the future can move you and those around you further away from a better way of life. The fact that you're not a person of vision or having a dream for your future is just not about you, sir. It's just not about you, ma'am. It's also about your wife, your husband, your children, your grandchildren. It's about your friends, your family. It's about your business. It's about your community. It's about your world. Here are 10 people who brought back a bad report and they influenced millions of people. 10 people influenced millions of people to give up on a better way, a better day. 10 voices talked millions of people out of a dream or a vision that God promised could be their reality. And it reminds us of something we know is true. We've experienced this. We see this in this story. We see this in other stories. That the easy thing to do is rarely the best thing to do. The easy thing to do is rarely the best thing to do. It's easy not to have a dream for the future. It's easy not to have a vision for the future. That's easy. Anybody can do that. Anybody can be afraid. Anybody can know that, hey, yeah, there's something better, but it's too risky. I'm going to have to change too much. I'm going to have to give up some things. I'm going to have to readjust my priorities. Anybody can choose the easy thing to do. But here's the thing you find about God so often in the scriptures. God seldom asks his people to do the easy thing. God often invites his people to do the difficult thing. And just because it's difficult doesn't mean that God's not in it. And just because it's tough doesn't mean that God's not in it. Sometimes God gives you a dream. God gives you a vision for the future. And he never promised it would be easy. He promised them this land, but they're going to have to fight for it. But they don't want to fight for it. They want to go the easy way. And it says, that night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. Can you imagine what it was like to be Moses and lead those people? It's one thing to preach a sermon and nobody says amen. It's one thing to preach a sermon and nobody looks up. But can you imagine trying to lead a group of people and at the end of church today you all just begin to wail and weep because you hated life? That's not a pick-me-up. I mean, they all just start crying and wailing, and it's just a horrible situation that's broke out in the camp because now negativity, pessimism, lack of vision, lack of dream, it's affected everybody. It's affected everybody. And it says all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The implication, everybody but Joshua and Caleb. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly and said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. And this is not the only if only that this generation is going to have to wrestle with before they die. Why is the Lord? Because people with little vision and no dream often end up blaming God for the circumstance they're in. Why did the Lord bring us out to this land only to let us fall by the sword? They've not fell by the sword. Nobody's even raised the sword against them yet. But you know what they've got? They've got vision based on fear. And you know what fear is? It's having faith that it won't work out. That's what fear is. It's having faith that it won't work out. They can envision a future, but they assume that it's going to be worst case scenario. They assume failure. They assume that it's not going to work out. They've got a vision for the future, but it's fear. It's fear-based. Why has God brought us out here to fall by the sword? And then listen to this. This sounds sanctimonious. This sounds godly. Listen to the men. This is how men talk when they get afraid. Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. This has nothing to do with us being cowards. This has nothing to do with us having itty-bitty faith. This is about the women and the children. We want to save them and protect them, and this is for them, and this is not about us. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? Really? Go back to being slaves? I mean, these people are delusional. And people who have no dream and vision for the future, you know what they end up doing? They end up falling in love with the past and thinking the past was better than it actually was. Because this is a group of people who've already said, boy, those melons were awesome in Egypt. That fish, man, it was awesome. And it was free. Free? You were slaves. It wasn't free. We live in a false reality. And some of us, the reason we're not going anywhere, the reason we're not experiencing progress and we're not experiencing any kind of growth is because somehow we have bought into the fact that somewhere yesterday was the best day. Some of you that are married, you look back on your dating years. You know, you call each other. Good night. Love you. No, you hang up first. No, you hang up first. No, I love you more. No, I love you more. No, I love you. Let's just hang up at the same time. 1, 2, you didn't hang up. And you look back on that day as your best day. Some of you parents, you have no vision for the future because your kids are at that age. Boy, you really miss them being 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And you think the best day was yesterday. And you don't realize how subtle that thievery is of your future. And you look back on your old profession as the best day ever. And you live in a false reality. And in doing so, you're forfeiting your future. And that's exactly what's going on in this moment. Wouldn't it be better if we could just go back? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and just go back to Egypt. Because those without a vision use others as an excuse and blame others as the cause for their lack of progress. And that's what's happening in this moment. Let's blame God. Let's blame other people. Let's blame our leaders. Let's blame anybody but us for being in the circumstance that we are in. Let's blame other people for how we feel. Let's blame other people for how we respond. Let's blame other people for being the way that we are. Let's escape all responsibility altogether, and let's use other people and let's blame other people. Because that's what people with no dream and no vision do. It's never their fault. They've never chosen the circumstance they're in. But here's a group of people that are wailing. And you know what they're wailing? It's self-imposed misery. And if you'd been their friend and they looked at you and they would have said, I'm miserable, that would have been true. But the part that they're never honest about is saying, I'm miserable because I'm choosing to be. This is self-imposed misery to which many can fall victim to. And then it says Joshua, son of Nun, not son of a nun, but Joshua, son of Nun. That'd be a problem, right? So, yeah, we'll edit that out. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, were among those who had explored the land. They tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and He will give it to us. So do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. The King James, the New King James, the English Standard Version translates this verse a little differently. And Joshua and Caleb says, we will eat them like bread. When all the other 10 spies said, they're giants, they can't be defeated. Joshua and Caleb, with such faith in God, that God is who God says He is, and that God will do everything that God says He will do. They looked at the same obstacles, the same giants, the same fight, and says, we're going to eat them like bread. And at the end of it, we're going to be better. We're going to be stronger. We're going to devour them. It's as good as God said. What are we waiting on? Let's go. Two conflicting visions, one based in faith, one based in fear. And in that moment, as these two visions are being presented, in that moment, they did not know what was hanging in the balance, and neither do we. In the moment, we never know what we may be giving up by giving in to fear. We never know. You never know the progress. You never know the breakthrough. You never know the blessing. You never know what you may be giving up by giving in to fear. So what did they do? They opted to go the other way. They opted to go the way of fear rather than faith. They opted not for the vision of Caleb and Joshua. And because of it, God said, an entire generation will die with regret. Everyone 20 and older, save Joshua and Caleb, are going to die in the wilderness. And you're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And because they gave up the vision that God had given them for the future, an entire generation is going to be forced to wander in the wilderness every single day for the next 40 years as they all begin to die. And every single one of them will die on their bed wondering, what if? What could have been? What should have been? Had we listened that day? Had we gone the way of faith? If we had just embraced what God had said was ours. And an entire generation is going to die with regret. But Caleb, no regret. And even though he's there with them for 40 years, he's not going to give up on his dream. He's not going to give up on his vision. He's not going to allow negative people to have power over him. Now listen, when you give people power over you, you forfeit the future God has for you. Every single time you allow somebody to have power over you, you will inevitably forfeit the future God has for you. And some of you, you gave up a long time ago because somebody told you you couldn't, somebody told you you shouldn't. It was your mom, it was your dad, it was your sister, it was your brother, it was your best friend, it was your boss, and somebody who was small brain and no vision, no dream for the future. They told you it couldn't be done, and you believed them. You believed them, and you gave up. Caleb refused to give up. So let's fast forward 40 plus years. Moses is gone. Joshua has led the nation of Israel across the Jordan River. Now they're fighting for the land that they gave up on 40 plus years before. And as they're fighting for the land, and as the land is being divided up among the different tribes, Caleb comes to Joshua. And there's a conversation that's recorded that we can eavesdrop on between Caleb and Joshua. Caleb comes to Joshua and says this. I was 40 years old. He's thinking back. He says, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. He's thinking about all the things we just talked about. He said, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. But my fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. I refused to go the way of the majority. I refused to do the easy thing. So on that day, Moses swore to me. Moses made a promise to me on behalf of God. The land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance and that of your children. Because when you dream appropriately, your dream just won't affect you. It will affect more than you. It will reach greater than what you could ever imagine. And here's the thing, if your dream only affects you, it shouldn't be worthy of you. If your dream only deals with you, it's really not a dream worthy of you. This is a dream about Caleb and his children. I was getting in the garage this morning, it was about 6 a.m. or so, and Shepherd was up, and I left him in the living room, and his mom was, just kind of in bed, and I told Shepherd I'm headed to church, and he said, okay, see you, Dad. And then I was getting ready to get in the car, and I saw the garage door open into the house. And I couldn't see him, but I could hear him because Allison's vehicle was parked in between us. And he said, Dad, I love you, and I will come see you after church. I said, that's great, it's awesome. And I was thinking about this verse, and I was thinking about my son, and thinking about Grayson, who's still in bed. And I was thinking, if I get this right, not perfect, but if I do a good job and Allison does a good job, this is bigger than me. This is bigger than me. This is about my children. This is about my grandchildren. This is about my great-grandchildren. This is about a legacy handed down from one generation to the next. He says it's going to belong to you, your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Now then, just as the Lord promised, because he's never given up on, God's going to keep his promise. God promised it then. This is 40 plus years later. Just as God promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years. Now, let me say this to you. If you have a pulse this morning or suspect you have a pulse, God has kept you alive on purpose. God has a plan for you. He says, God has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses. While Israel moved about in the wilderness, and I don't know how you think about Scripture, but when I read it, I try to read it with some imagination. I can imagine for 40 years, perhaps Caleb and Joshua, as an entire generation was dropping dead around them. I can imagine Caleb and Joshua hanging out underneath the stars in that desert, looking up, and perhaps Caleb would look at Joshua and say, you remember that story about God promising Abraham that one day his descendants would be as the stars of the sky? Joshua, look around us. Look at all these millions of people in camp with us. God, he's keeping that promise. Joshua, what do you think it's going to be like when we get there? It's kind of hard for me to remember exactly what those pomegranates taste like, but I just remember those were the best pomegranates I've ever had. It's going to be so awesome. And they dream and they talk about the future that one day would be. And Caleb has not given up on that through the 40 years of wilderness. 40 years he's had to wait. He says, so here I am today, still chasing what I was chasing then. 45 years ago, I was chasing it. Here I am today, 85 years old, and I'm still chasing it. My pastor, Pastor Johnny, says it this way: a life well lived, like Caleb's life, is a life where you want in the end what you wanted in the beginning. And here's Caleb at the end of his life, still wanting what he wanted in the very beginning. 45 years ago. And he says, I'm still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I don't know if it's true, but he felt as though it was true. What kept him strong? What kept him young at heart? A dream, the vision for the future. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. And then we remember these words, right? Caleb builds up and then he says this, now therefore, give me this mountain. At 85 years old, Moses, promise me this mountain. Joshua, if I have to die for this mountain, I'm going to die for this mountain. I've been looking at this mountain in my dream. God promised it to me. I've given my life to it. I'm willing to give my life for it. Give me this mountain. Do you have a mountain? Do you have a mountain? Something you've been dreaming about? Something you have a vision of? And there's enemies on that mountain? The odds are not in your favor on that mountain. And you've been holding out for year after year after year after year after year, but now you feel like maybe the time. Do you have a mountain? And could you perhaps have the vision and the faith of a Caleb that says, I've waited a long time, but give me my mountain. I'm willing to fight for it. I'm willing to die for it. Hey, listen, that mountain is my marriage. I'm willing to fight for it. I'm willing to die for it. That mountain is my child. He's a prodigal. She's a prodigal. I'm willing to fight for it. Give me this mountain. What's your mountain? You have a mountain? See, the only thing worse than not dreaming is dreaming and not doing anything about it. The only thing worse than not dreaming is dreaming and not doing anything about it. We wouldn't be talking about Caleb if he had dreamed for 40 years in the wilderness and then stood before his mountain and said, it's taller than I remember. Those people are bigger than I remember. I think I'll settle for something else. We wouldn't be talking about it. He says, now therefore, give me this mountain, of which the Lord spoke in that day. For you heard in that day how the Anakim were there, and that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out as the Lord has said. Then Joshua blessed Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, ever since, because he followed the Lord God of Israel wholeheartedly. When you believe God, listen to this, when you believe God enough to lose your life, that is the moment you will find your life. That was Caleb. He believed God enough that he was willing to lose his life to get that mountain. And when you believe God enough to lose your life over what you believe, that is the moment that you will find your life. That is exactly what Jesus said. Jesus said, you try to save your life, what will happen? You'll lose it. If you're willing to lose your life for my sake, what will happen? You'll find it. Caleb had given his life to this. And at 85, he was willing to give his life for this. And that's when his dream became reality. What's your mountain? What are you dreaming for? Is it important enough to give your life to it? Is it important enough that you'd be willing to give your life for it? And do you believe God enough to lose your life over it? And I think when we get to that place, that's the moment that we come alive. That's the moment when faith comes within us in such a powerful, powerful force. When we believe God enough to lose our life, that's when we find it. We believe some crazy things as Christians. We believe that God loves us just as we are. We believe that God sent his son into the world to die for us just as we are. We believe that Jesus died and was buried and was raised from the dead. We believe that. We believe that. And if we believe that, shouldn't we also believe the same God who said, I've got a plan to prosper you and not harm you, to give you a hope and a future? Shouldn't we also believe the God who also said, ask and it'll be given, seek and you'll find, knock, it'll be open to you? And if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you'll be able to look at your mountain and say, be cast into the sea, and it shall be done, because nothing will be impossible to those who believe. Father, help us to believe that you are who you say you are, that you will do what you said you will do. Help us to know that you cannot, you shall not, you will not lie. You look for something to swear by, and you can find nothing to swear by greater than yourself. And we can trust you. Help us to believe what we say we believe, and then to respond as though we truly believe it. Give us a vision for the future and help us to begin to pursue it even now, even if it's difficult, even if it's tough. Help us to pursue it beginning right now. In Jesus' name, amen.